I'm learning this month, that forgiveness is a powerful and complicated thing. I was a little surprised last week to hear from so many people about how important this topic is to them and their challenges. So today's sermon is actually inspired by a writing by Kent Nerburn. He talks about the precarious position of deciding to grant forgiveness or to withhold it, because we don't want to be complicit in the wrongdoings by holding no one accountable. Nor do we want to be part of a cycle of retribution. Making others suffer to make ourselves feel better does not lead anywhere good. Sorting out when and how to forgive is complicated. Kent Nerburn writes, "One of the great human wagers is whether we best achieve this by shining a light of pure absolution into the darkness, trusting that the light will draw others toward it, or whether we stand against the darkness with equal force, then try to flood the world with light once the darkness is held at bay." His great description of two options reminds me of two very different models of justice and forgiveness. One is about freely casting a light into the darkness, hoping it will attract others. It doesn't require justice first. It offers openness and love as an opening move. To me and to many people for centuries, the parable of the prodigal son typifies that type of forgiveness. This story comes up in only one version of the Gospels. It's in Luke, when Jesus is sitting around telling a bunch of stories to anyone who would listen. And he tells this story. He says, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them." And this isn't a kind thing to say to one's father. "Hey, you're getting older. I want what's coming my way so I can go have some fun." I don't imagine that conversation going well anywhere. But it seemed to work for this father. Jesus continues the story. "Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had and set off for a distant country where he squandered his wealth on wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he found himself in need. So he went and hired himself to a citizen of that country who sent him out to the fields to feed pigs." This is a bad situation. By hiring himself out, he wasn't exactly a slave in the ancient world, but he was definitely giving away some of his freedom. And we can safely assume that the people hearing this story are mostly Jews, and assuming that the characters are Jews. Pork is a big no-no. We know that. This son has found himself in physically unpleasant work and work that is really morally problematic. So the story continues. "He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's servants have food to spare, and here I am starving? I'll set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you.' So he got up and went on his way." Now, this is an important moment of sincere humility. He didn't say, "He'll get over it. That'll take me back." Now, this is an important transition when we're talking about forgiveness. The son came to a deep realization that he had made a grave mistake. He thought, "I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." The story continues. "But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.'" Those words sting. I can't imagine what it would take to say that to a parent or to hear those from your child. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robes, put them on him. Bring a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast to celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found." And they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came closer to the house, he heard the music and the dancing, and he asked one of the servants, "What's going on?" And the servant explained, "Your brother came home, and your father has killed the fatted calf to celebrate." The older brother became angry, and he refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded. But he answered his father, "All these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a goat so I could celebrate with my friends." His frustration is understandable. We all get a little frustrated when someone else gets rewarded when we've been doing the work all along. It's just not fair. Forgiving others when we have followed the rules is so hard. "All these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders." "My son," the father said, "you're always with me. Everything that I have is yours, but we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again." I preach about this parable of the prodigal son more than any other for a couple of reasons. One is that the parable paints, to me, the most compelling picture of the sacred. It's love and grace that are available to all. It's a simple love. It's unearned, unrestrained. Our task is to let go of our pride, let go of some control, and settle into the goodness that life has to offer. The other reason that this parable comes up in my mind over and over is that what it asks us is so difficult, and maybe the most important task of our lives. It's all about reconciliation. Now, it's easy to read this parable and depict the father as sort of the God figure. But a more useful reading of the story is to put ourselves in each of those three roles. Like the prodigal son, we have all made mistakes and faced the challenging moment of deciding to turn back and say, "I'm sorry." That turning back is hard sometimes. We've also been in the position, like the father, to give forgiveness, not because it's efficient or logical, but because we find life and joy in those relationships. And maybe most challenging of all, we have been in the role of the older brother, the good brother. I suspect that as we law-abiding, mostly middle-class Unitarian Universalists, this older brother role is the challenge most often set before us. We're called to set aside our resentment when we have followed the rules and others seek forgiveness for breaking them. The parable keeps calling me back because it sets such a very high bar. And if we intend to shine that light of forgiveness, optimistically hoping to attract others, this is the story for us. If, on the other hand, for the sake of justice, we need to uphold the concerns of the victim, there are other ways to build reconciliation, to move toward forgiveness. In the past couple of months, I've heard about restorative justice in a few different venues. I'd actually heard it several times before, so I decided to dig in a little bit this week and to learn for myself what it's all about. Restorative justice emphasizes repairing relationships. It's focused on people rather than laws on paper. Now, that alone is a huge shift. When we typically think of crime, we think of breaking an abstract law, violating a rule that's written down on a piece of paper somewhere. But restorative justice thinks more of the impact on living, breathing people. And in that consideration of people, it brings in a whole community to talk about the impacts of a crime committed. Success isn't measured by punishment inflicted. Instead, success is measured by how much repair can be done and how much harm can be prevented in the future. And I know all of this sounds like pie in the sky. Before I go too much further, it's important to know that versions of this are happening all over the world. As long as an offender admits responsibility and all parties are willing to participate, huge progress can and is being made. The really straightforward model of this is mediation between a victim and an offender directly. It gives the victim a chance to meet their offender in a safe and structured environment. With a trained facilitator, the victim discusses the crime together. The session also encourages the offender to learn about the impact that they've had. There are more than 300 victim-offender mediation programs in North America. This stuff is happening. There are over 500 in Europe. Research suggests that everyone involved finds more satisfaction in this. It also lowers the likelihood that offenses will be repeated. Some pretty astonishing improvements on a broken criminal justice system. A slightly different model includes families and community groups in the mediation. That helps the offender understand the impact that has been made on a wider community. It also brings that community in to support the offender as they seek to make amends and to improve the situation. Now, this community-based strategy came out of New Zealand and the Maori people there. It's interesting, the social services department in New Zealand began using it when they saw it, and the police force in Australia then brought it from New Zealand, and now similar models are being used in North America and Europe and Southern Africa. The third way of doing restorative justice is called peacemaking or sentencing circles. Now, this is probably the biggest circle and the most complicated. It seeks to build some consensus among the community members, the victim supporters, offenders, offender supporters, judges, prosecutors, defense counsel, police, and court, working together on sentencing. The circle was adapted from Native American tradition, and it's now used throughout North America. Each of these models of restorative justice ends with an agreement on how an offender will make amends for the particular harm caused. That typically includes some financial restitution and community service. And we have all heard of community service that's designed to punish. It's doing long hours of work without any connection to the purpose of that work. But in restorative justice, community service is selected intentionally to help the community offended. So, for example, offenders who put graffiti on buildings in a neighborhood can be given community service of removing graffiti in that particular neighborhood. This type of work has been formally around for less than 20 years, but it's now all over the world and making a big impact. On Thursday, a few Tapestry members attended a breakfast hosted by the California Council of Equality and Justice, and we learned there that the Long Beach Police Department has actually been using this for a couple of years, and it's making a big difference in recidivism for low-level crimes. So this is a whole lot of information about a type of program that you probably won't be directly involved in. We also don't live in the ancient world of squandered inheritances and fatted calves. But I wanted to share these examples with you of forgiveness in detail as a reminder that people are thinking through this business of justice and reconciliation and forgiveness in some really creative ways. Forgiveness can look like a universal, loving, welcome home. It can also take more structure with an eye toward reconciliation and justice. Whether we cast a blanket forgiveness, casting a light and hoping that it will attract the good, or if we put some parameters on our forgiveness with the intent of healing and growth, reconciliation is always possible. The goal, as hard as it is always rebuilding relationship. Amen.